For years now, Halo has struggled to evolve. It seems like every change, every new addition is met with controversy and backlash from the community. While no doubt there are a lot of people who like the newer Halo games, I think even they would admit that there is a lot of division amongst the fans of this franchise. But why is this the case? Why does Halo struggle to innovate in a way that satisfies its audience? Well, that's what I'd like to talk about today. The obvious answer many will have is that it just hasn't evolved in the right way. If you followed this channel, or even really just the game in general, you will have no doubt heard the argument for a Halo game that evolves via sandbox innovations rather than alterations to its base mechanics. If that is a foreign concept to you, I'd encourage you to watch my video How to Innovate Halo Without Changing Its Formula, and then come back and watch this one. And that position and argument has become pretty popular, especially amongst the fans who want a more classic experience, and I to this day believe it should be the direction Halo goes in. But I don't think regurgitating why I think a game like that would be great actually answers the question here. Because even if you understand that position, hell, you may even think it might be good, why is that the only way? Plenty of games introduce new gameplay mechanics without issue. Plenty of games give more options to the player and nobody bats an eye. Not too long ago, Borderlands 3 showed off its gameplay and it added sliding and mantling up ledges. Guess what? Nobody gave a shit. Halo gives you the ability to climb up ledges. Oh, well, that just completely destroys the map design, trivializes navigation in vertical spaces, eliminates the need to be precise with your jumps. It's not even Halo anymore. 343's got to be sitting there going, you got to be fucking kidding me. And everything I just said is a lot more complicated than I made it out to be, but I do empathize with 343 to an extent. All they've tried to do is evolve Halo through an avenue that most games evolve in and do so successfully, through altering or adding new base mechanics, new player abilities, new buttons that do things, and yet they've had a very difficult time of it. So what about Halo makes it so sensitive to change? What about it makes it so those types of additions feel more invasive to its formula? What about Halo causes its struggle to evolve? And I think it starts with this concept. Halo's simplicity is integral to its identity. When you look at the original games from a gameplay perspective, they were very simple. Your connection to the game and how you interacted with it was easy to pick up, and that allowed the game to be accessible. However, there was still depth within its mechanics in the sandbox and the way it created encounters with its map design, so that it still offered opportunities for mastery. And that created a perfect storm where the game was easy to pick up, but worthwhile to learn and get better at. Somehow, despite its simplicity, it struck a balance that to this day feels unique, unlike anything else on the market. It has a distinct pace and cadence. This, along with a lack of excessive base mechanics, allow players to predict encounters and strategize around those player limitations. Its nature meant movement and combat existed simultaneously, and thus there was a harmony between the two. Map traversal could be performed all with your gun up and ready to fire, and this plus Halo's unique take on sandbox design and the emphasis on headshots also gave it a very unique feel. Its simplicity gave it its unique pace, its harmony of movement and combat, its ability to allow players to predict and strategize, and because that simplicity is so important to Halo, it means Halo is very sensitive to change, specifically where those base mechanics are concerned. It really is kind of balanced on this fulcrum where it's not quite a traditional arena shooter, it's not really a modern shooter, it's just kind of its own thing, and any new addition to its gameplay formula, no matter how small, tips the scale in a way that changes what makes it so unique. Its simplicity makes it unique. And because modern Halos have tried really hard to add new base mechanics, make the game less simple, Halo has struggled to evolve without changing a lot of what made many people fall in love with it in the first place. And I wanted to start this video off today saying that because Halo's gameplay is great, and it needs to be noted that for some people, this alone is worth going back to and building on, and I could make an entire video just focused on these things. And yet, despite it being a huge factor in this whole equation, it's not even really what the focus of my video today is. In addition to Halo's gameplay offering something unique in its own right, it also allowed it to act as the glue for all the creative ideas you put around it. It's modular, and I've said that before, but today we're going to be taking an even deeper dive into what this means for Halo and its struggle to maintain its identity through its years of attempted evolution. And really, it all comes down to mechanics. Now, as we've established, modern Halo games have focused on giving mechanics to the player. Press this button to do this thing. Obviously, Halo 5's abundance of Spartan abilities are the prime example of that, and it makes sense. A lot of games introduce mechanics in this way, but it's not the only way to add new mechanics. It's not what Halo did. You see, you can create new experiences and gameplay opportunities without changing how the player fundamentally interacts with the world. You can attach mechanics to more than just the player, and I kind of break it down into 5 categories. 1, yes, you can attach mechanics to the player. This, as we've established, is very common, and we've already talked about it a lot in this video, but you can also attach mechanics to your sandbox. These are weapons and vehicles, or really anything else the player can interact with and utilize as a tool. Next, you can attach mechanics to the environment itself. This includes level design and layouts, which can create their own gameplay opportunities, but it also includes contextual environmental interactions like dynamic map elements, man cannons, gravity lifts, etc. Mechanics you find in the environment. You can also attach mechanics to AI. Things like throwing a grenade at an elite and having him roll away, or a grunt getting scared when you kill another AI that is considered the leader, those are mechanics. Those are gameplay elements the player can experience. And lastly, I'd like to include attaching mechanics to objectives. These are like game modes and rules that the player operates under. When you're playing Capture the Flag has properties associated with it. You score by entering the enemy base, stealing it, bringing it back to your base, and the game rewards you with a point. That's a mechanic. Game modes create gameplay. So here we have a list of various different avenues of innovation. And when you look at this list, I just want you all to sit there and think about those older Halo games and consider just how many of these things were important to the identity of those games. Think of all the iconic weapons this franchise has introduced via its sandbox, or the legacy of maps and missions, these wonderful environments we've played in. Consider the AI and how revolutionary it was going all the way back to Combat Evolved, and also consider how much content these games had, the breadth of game modes and ways to play. These are objectives. All of these things are aspects I think many people would agree help define what Halo was. And here's the thing. Halo's simplicity meant it needed to excel in these other categories. It needed all the pieces around its base mechanics to be great, and they were. They were defining aspects to Halo's identity just as much as the gameplay was. Because not only did Halo's simplicity mean it needed to excel in these other categories, but it also allowed it to. It actively aided in making those other parts of the game better. Because of its minimal base mechanics, it meant there were less attributes and factors that designers had to consider when they were, designing the game. And so naturally, this made innovating in those other categories easier. When modern Halo games altered Halo's formula, it didn't just change the gameplay, but it, through the influence of those changes, also changed all of these other aspects that made Halo great. Its map design. It always bothers me when people say, "Oh, I love the new abilities, we just need better maps." But the reality is these maps are designed to accommodate those abilities in the first place. In the original trilogy, map designers had a lot of control over the environment. Player limitations meant there were less factors they had to consider when creating new play spaces, but now players can sprint, thrust, slide, climb, hover, and combine all of these things to achieve movement that is far beyond what was previously possible. And guess what? Designers have to try and design encounters around all of that. They have to account for it. We've talked about in the past concepts like map stretching and dead zones, where due to the enhanced movement, it means designers have to build larger play spaces to accommodate them. But because combat takes place at a speed that is different than maximum speed, it means that when you design these maps around the abilities, then when you actually have to stop and fight, the map isn't scaled optimally for combat itself. Halo has lost its harmony of movement and combat taking place simultaneously, and it has thus lost its ability for maps to be built for both at the same time. There's always going to be a little bit of a disconnect, and I'm not going to go too much deeper than this because I have a map design video in the works and I don't want to step on its toes too badly, but still, hopefully this example is enough to at least point out the connection between map design and the base mechanical changes 343 have implemented. And to show you a quick example of some of these concepts at work, here's a piece that was put together by a channel called Brothers of Halo, and it's just a simple test on Truth and Heretic in Halo 3, highlighting the rescaling that modern Halo games have to go through to account for the new gameplay. You can see here that Halo 3's base movement speed will get you to the same spot on Heretic actually faster than sprinting to the same spot on Truth in Halo 5. And that just goes to show you that when it came time to remake midship in Halo 5, they had to account for the new movement of the game and thus the clearly observable rescaling that we can see Truth had to go through. And by looking at how it changed a map we all know and love, hopefully we can visualize how these abilities affect new maps that are being designed for Halo. And lastly, to build upon this example, I'd like to show you a video made by Philip Gann that adds a bit more context to how this influences maps and the gameplay that occurs on them. And honestly, he put it so concisely, I'm just going to play his clip.
So here's a similar comparison video. Notice how in Halo 5 you're restricted to an animation the entire time, whereas in Halo 2 you can shoot, throw grenades, even turn 360 degrees, all while moving at top speed. In this next example you'll see how clamber has the same effect. Much like how maps were lengthened to accommodate sprint, the height of ledges were also increased to accommodate clamber. Once again you're punished for moving around the map, locked into a pointless animation. To contrast, in Halo 2 you can do every jump in the game facing backwards, while shooting, while throwing grenades, or meleeing. You're never locked into an animation while traversing the map. So which one is truly enhanced mobility?
With these abilities, maps are harder to design, they're harder to test, they're harder to control, and thus they are changed. And they feel different, and they play different. The added complexity to Halo's base mechanics altered not only how we play maps, but how the maps are designed in the first place. The weapon sandbox. Again, it absolutely creates more complications here. You add more complexity, you make players more agile, well, you have to design weapons around that. Maybe you make weapons more forgiving because players have more ability to evade and escape encounters. If players are faster, if they have more options available to them, then you have to make guns that can compensate for that. If players are harder to hit, then guns need to be better at hitting them, more forgiving. For instance, by giving some guns a lot of bullet magnetism. Now, keep in mind, sandboxes can change drastically from game to game anyway. There are a lot of decisions made for just personal design preference and not necessarily because gameplay mechanics forced them to. But in addition to stylistic changes, of course you have to adjust and design around the gameplay of the game. And rather than me trying to convince you that some of these under the hood systems exist, here's 343 talking about them.
Each weapon has a few different settings that makes the handling a bit different. One of the biggest parts is the aim assist. So you can see the reticle turns red when I'm close or almost on him. That means that the aim assist is fully engaged and your shots are going to go toward that target. Now, if we turn on the debug stuff here, you'll see a ton of different circles here. This little cross here that you see is actually where the bullets will bend towards, where your aim is actually corrected to. And as I go over him, you'll see it actually snaps to him. It kind of gets back to the center of my actual reticle. And this other angle out here, this is the magnetism. Magnetism basically means that we slow down your turning speed when you get close to an enemy. And the reason for that is that you won't just sweep over him. It'll kind of stick. And also, when you're inside of the magnetism cone, any movement that this guy does, your reticle will try and follow him to correct. So when a guy is strafing, if you're inside of the magnetism, you get a little bit of assistance to help track him.
Now please keep in mind, I'm not trying to say it's easy to aim in Halo 5. I'm not even saying that these methods of assisting players are unique to Halo 5. The older Halo games had them to varying degrees as well. But what I am trying to highlight is that due to Halo 5's additional base mechanics, these concepts have to be altered in various ways, and it is of course far more difficult to strike the right balance across the sandbox as a whole. And I think Halo 5's sniper rifle is a great example of that. It was given a lot of magnetism to help alleviate the added difficulty of sniping players who can now move so much faster than before. And I'm sure a few of you have maybe noticed that, and it led to kills that didn't strike the right balance and left you feeling like some bullshit just occurred.
At home as well. Hines with the sniper. He's gonna post out and he'll get sniped by Sub-Zero. And that's gonna be it. 50-49. Oh my gosh.
I'm surprised. Oh, we gotta get a replay of that last snipe because I'm surprised that hit. That totally looked like it was through the wall. I don't know, maybe it was through a crack in the wall or something like that. It was definitely a body shot. Hines took a little bit too much damage overall. Taking a look at the
sniper.
I just want to see this last snipe. That's all I want to see, is that one through the wall. It should be coming up right about here. There it is, and that definitely, you guys saw it, that went through the wall.
So you have to kind of find that balance where it's helping you enough.
Maybe you don't notice that it's helping that
much.
Right.
If we do our job well, you actually don't
yeah.
have any idea that this is going on.
Yeah, it just feels like you're that badass.
Yeah.
all of these little subtleties that may not be apparent immediately, but you feel them. They're there in your subconscious. All the little tweaks and assists that are given to help make these weapons feel good with these abilities. And AI. We primarily talked about how changes affect multiplayer, but it's not limited to that. And it's not the only important part of Halo that has changed. Again, you think of how important Halo's AI is. To use the examples from before, they roll away from grenades. They get scared when their leaders are taken out. There's multiple species with different gameplay attached to each and multiple ranks within those individual species. It was complex. And when you have a limited base kit, those complexities become more relevant because you only have so many options. When you add additional abilities to the player, they of course have more individual agency and thus can circumvent some of those designs to an extent. They don't have to pay quite as much attention to the enemy when they can do so much on their own. Instead of looking for a leg up and advantage, they can just create their own advantage. But it's a double-edged sword because you also have to try and design AI around these abilities as well. It's one thing to ask, what does an elite do when you throw a grenade at it? How does it react when you shoot it, etc.? Halo's AI has behaviors built around these things. But what about when a player sprints, or slides, or climbs, or initiates a ground pound, or any of these other various abilities? For every one of these you don't consider, you prove my previous point. And for every one of these you try to have the AI identify and react to, you prove this one. Altering Halo's simplicity make AI encounters feel different and harder to design overall. Lastly, we have objectives, or goals. The modes of play the game offers, well, it follows a similar theme. The older games made it easier for developers to create content, and the newer ones make it harder. And thus you could argue that's why the older games had seemingly more content. Is it a coincidence that Halo 5 launched with the least amount of game modes in the series? Is it a coincidence that standard features present in past Halos weren't there? It's harder to make. It's harder to make weapons and maps and compelling AI and modes that work with them. This in addition to a separate issue where 343 just doesn't maximize their resources very well. And if you're interested in that, I have multiple videos on that subject as well. So now that I've just kind of briefly touched on all of these subjects, do you see why Halo might struggle to evolve? Do you see why base mechanics and Halo's insistence on evolving them change Halo in more ways than you might have originally thought? And by the way, we're just scratching the surface. It doesn't just change the great simple gameplay Halo used to have, because that simple gameplay allowed it to excel and innovate in so many other aspects that are also integral to Halo's identity. So when you change it, you subsequently and consequentially also change all of these other things that made Halo great, that made it what it was. And that's what I mean when I say Halo's simplicity was the glue for all the creative ideas you put around it. And because modern games have consistently tried to alter Halo's base mechanics, it has subsequently altered all of these attributes that defined Halo. And that's why it has struggled to evolve. Everything is connected. And so that's why people like myself are convinced that going back to the classic gameplay is Halo's best chance. And I hope now that you see all that it affects, you understand that position a little bit better, both as someone who maybe already believe that and now are maybe more equipped to explain why they feel that way, but also for someone who likes the newer games, maybe it opens your mind to why we're so adamant and unwavering about our position, and hopefully maybe it will have shown you what is possible with this type of game. Because this video not only outlined what changes when you alter Halo's player mechanics, but it also showed you the door for innovating Halo in the future. And it's frustrating when people say we don't want Halo to evolve, because it's the opposite. We want Halo's old gameplay so it can evolve through all of these other avenues that we just went through together. And look, we just scratched the surface. I brought up 5 topics that could be their own video, and we could really take a deep dive into how each one works and is affected, and soon that's exactly what we're going to do on this channel. But today, I just wanted to show you that they're all connected and related, and changes have a ripple effect that influences all of them. So in conclusion, I'd like to end on 2 examples. The first example is we're going to look at an encounter within the Halo franchise that highlights every item on this list. I think it's important to kind of visualize all of these pieces working together and show what those Halo games did and how encounters could be built going forward. But I also think it's important to try and draw comparisons with other games as well, because so many decisions and thoughts on how Halo should evolve are based on how other games have evolved. So I'd like to end by showing you a game that evolved more in line with how I think Halo should. And visualizing that, I hope, will help you see that, yes, what I've been talking about has practical application and results. First, let's bring the list back up on the screen, and I want to bring your attention to a mission from Halo 3 called The Storm, particularly this one encounter with the Scarab. Now, keep in mind, this isn't a scripted fight. There is no predetermined path to taking this thing down, and you're not loaded with a bunch of abilities to assist you. Instead, we start with the objective, to board the Scarab and take it down from the inside, which is our goal that drives the action forward. And we have our sweet and simple classic gameplay that we all know and love. This is the glue. Now, what aspects have we put around it? Well, I think we should start with the Scarab itself. Like I said, this is not scripted or predetermined. This is an actual individual piece of AI. It is its own unit, and I don't think people understand just how impressive that is. It has a mind of its own. It is reactionary. It's basically just like any other piece of AI in the game, but bigger and with its own set of behavior. So how do we take this thing down? What are our tools? Well, we have rocket launchers that the game provides for us. We have mongooses that we can ride around under the Scarab all the while shooting at it and having these really fun fights. We also have missile pods that we can take control of that lock onto the Scarab, and that in itself is an interesting interaction. With either of these weapons, by doing enough damage to the legs of the Scarab, it will lower itself so that you can board, where despite being an AI, also has AI like brutes and grunts defending it from within. However, there are also environmental interactions. Of course, there is the layout that all these components exist in, but we also have dynamic map elements. You can take an elevator up to one of these giant cranes, and if the Scarab is close enough, you can actually jump straight on without even lowering it and fight your way to its weak spot in the back. So here we have all of these avenues of innovation working at the exact same time in this just really nice encounter. Simple mechanics surrounded by innovative AI that creates an interesting objective that can be achieved both through use of its sandbox or dynamic map elements, and that's Halo. That's its identity. You can make interesting encounters this way because there are so many different things you can attach mechanics to beyond the player character. And my last example will hopefully prove that, because we're going to talk about a mechanic I'm sure you're all very familiar with. I've talked about it a lot. Some would even say I'm known for it. We're going to talk about sprint, because the horse is not dead and thus still needs to be kicked. And I wouldn't be bringing this up again unless I felt like I had an interesting, worthwhile example, and I believe I do. Because instead of talking about how it changes Halo, despite this video talking about how base mechanics in general do that, we're actually going to talk about a completely different game. In fact, it's a game that doesn't have sprint at all. And bear with me, because that game is Portal 2. Now I know, on the surface that sounds batshit crazy. How am I going to use Portal 2 to help prove my point about Halo? They're completely different games. Well, that's because Portal 2 innovated from Portal 1 in a very similar way to what we've been describing. It didn't alter base mechanics and instead innovated within the game around it. It kept the glue, which is the portal gun in physics-based gameplay, and then created new ways within the environment to innovate and create new gameplay opportunities. What does this have to do with sprint? Because sprint would have been the solution used if they evolved Portal the same way Halo tried to evolve. You see, Portal is a physics-based game. When you build momentum and speed, you travel farther, and it is integral to many of the puzzles. So the developers are left with a question. How do we give the players more speed? The easy solution is a mechanic like sprint. Just a new button on the controller that a player can press, and hey, now I can run faster through a portal and shoot further out the other side. That's a modern Halo solution to a problem and a modern Halo innovation, but that's not what Portal did. Portal instead solved the same problem with an environmental mechanic called gel. Now, there's a few of these gels, each that offer their own unique gameplay that follow these principles, but today we're going to focus on one, and that is the propulsion gel. Basically, when you walk on it, it makes you go faster. It builds your speed and momentum, and this is used to solve various puzzles in the game. But oftentimes, the game doesn't tell you how to utilize this gel, and instead leaves it up to the player to figure out how to get the gel to the places it needs to be, and it actually is involved in the puzzle itself, and not just a tool to help you solve the puzzle. And that's absolutely genius. Because in this way, not only have you introduced a new method of allowing players to build momentum, but you've done it in a way that actually contributes to the puzzle-solving nature of the game. And you've done it in a way that can be controlled by the developer and thus only influence the parts of the game that they want it to. Now, imagine a sprint mechanic instead. First off, imagine how much less interesting these puzzles are. How do I generate momentum? Navigate this gel to these specific spots? Jump from a ledge to build momentum to fly out to the other side. Nope, just push this button to go faster and you're good. That would be less interesting for a game like Portal. But also consider the nature of sprint means it has to be accounted for going forward because it's a base mechanic. Now, every puzzle in Portal has to consider the fact that players can press a button to build momentum. And now you've made building momentum, a key component of the game, less interesting, while also making it harder to design levels going forward. Do you see some of the parallels of my example now? Portal 2 found a way to introduce a new speed and momentum mechanic into the game without compromising Portal's identity. In fact, they did it in such a way that complemented it. Think of how this style of innovation benefits a game like Portal 2. Because Halo is a game that could also do that. It too could evolve through ways beyond just adding player mechanics, and just like Portal 2, it can be a better game because of it, a more interesting game. When Halo adds new base mechanics, it alters crucial elements of Halo's identity, and it forces designers to consider those elements throughout every aspect of the experience. And I hope that this video has shown you the extent of what happens when you mess with its simple yet effective base formula, because that fantastically simple Halo gameplay paved the way for its enormous amount of content, its compelling encounters, its interesting weapons, and beloved map design. Halo has struggled to evolve because it has struggled to understand that all of these components made Halo what it was and that they are connected. And they were all possible in the first place because of the simplicity the people in charge so desperately want to change. Well, I hope this video has shown you why they shouldn't try to change those things anymore. I hope it's shown you why changing those things are so detrimental to Halo in particular, and most importantly, I hope it's shown you that it's still possible to innovate within this great franchise beyond player abilities. In fact, it's not just possible, it could be beneficial and incredible. It could really be something special. There is another way. Because Halo has struggled to evolve, but it doesn't have to. Till next time.